Hello, and welcome to the Evidence-Based Strategy Series, Guiding the Targeted Improvement Plan process. My name is Scott Ekman, and I am a regional lead for Nebraska MTSS.
And my name is Brooke Gabers. I'm the Region 3 support lead for Nebraska MTSS.
The Nebraska Multi-Tiered System of Support Team, in collaboration with the Nebraska Department of Education's Office of Special Education, has created a series of webinars to guide the implementation of the evidence-based strategies identified in the Targeted Improvement Plan. Since we know that students that are identified as needing special education support deserve to be in the general education classrooms first and foremost, these webinars should be used to support district and school-wide continuous improvement efforts. As part of this series, there are 4 crash course webinars that will focus on each of the evidence-based strategies. There's also a one staff rollout webinar, 4 classroom implementation webinars, and a data-based decision-making webinar. The purpose of this webinar series is to enhance the classroom implementation of evidence-based strategies with a focus on Tier 1 course support and Fidelity within an MTSS framework, and is applicable to all classrooms within a district. This can be beneficial for school leadership teams to assist in the facilitation of implementation, as well as educators directly implementing the strategy and administrators supporting those efforts. So welcome to the data-based decision-making webinar as part 4 of the series. Throughout this webinar, we will recognize the role of data-based decision-making in relation to implementation science. We're going to acknowledge the steps of the Nebraska MTSS Problem Solving Model as an approach to data-based decision-making, and we will identify examples of how to utilize the Nebraska MTSS Problem Solving Model within implementation of the Targeted Improvement Plan, or TIP.
So to get started, let's take a look at the relationship between data-based decision-making and implementation science. If you remember from the staff rollout and classroom implementation webinars, utilizing the stages of implementation is essential when guiding your team through a purposeful approach to managing any system change, in this case, implementing your TIP strategy. This data-based decision-making webinar focuses on providing support specifically during the full implementation stage, where the focus is, let's try for better. Although data-based decision-making should be used throughout all stages of implementation to make necessary adjustments. As we reach this stage of full implementation, our focus is on sustaining our work through a continuous improvement process. This stage is referred to as continuous regeneration by Goodman and McIntosh. Here, we are looking to make our process the most effective and efficient while responding to changes in our environment, such as new priorities or staff turnover. Hopefully by now, implementation is deeply embedded into the day-to-day business in your school or district. However, there are a few areas that you need to prepare for. One is that implementation can be neglected over time, so it's imperative that we monitor the fidelity of our practices. Another possible setback is staff turnover, where it is possible that many staff weren't around when your implementation began. You'll need to consider how you can develop a system for onboarding new staff. As you reach the full implementation stage, you will also engage in an ongoing process of reviewing and acting upon data. We'll be addressing this in the next objective. So in the full implementation stage, there are a few critical features of leadership support that should be noted. First, administrators should acknowledge their leadership team and staff frequently for their efforts and for moving in the right direction toward their goals, especially when related to fidelity of implementation. Administrators play a critical role in providing staff recognition for accomplishments. Acknowledgement is especially important anytime an activity is new or difficult for staff. We're going to be providing some examples of what this might look like on the next few slides. When providing that feedback, school leaders should also consider the science of ratios in the feedback they're providing to staff. For example, best practice would be to provide 5 positives to 1 negative. Finally, leadership teams should continue to revise their implementation plans based on the data they are collecting and analyzing. Your professional learning plan will and should adjust based on the data to meet staff needs as you adjust your action plans as well. Recognizing that regular, specific, and timely feedback to staff in regards to implementation of your selected tip strategy is a critical feature of leadership support. We wanted to provide you with some ideas and resources to acknowledge your staff's efforts. One easy practice is to begin all staff meetings by sharing any celebrations or wins, whether it's specific to a team or all of your staff. Regularly sharing data around your implementation of your strategy is another great idea. You might also consider implementing a peer recognition program, like establishing a peer praise board in the staff lounge. Celebrating employee efforts on social media or recognizing those efforts at board meetings is also effective in acknowledging the work your educators are doing to improve student learning outcomes. Notes of encouragement or gratitude are a simple yet effective way to acknowledge your staff. Beyond that, creating opportunities for students to acknowledge staff members can be even more impactful. We also know how important collaboration is when it comes to fostering equitable and inclusive learning environments that improve student outcomes. So encouraging staff members to showcase their personal knowledge by leading discussions or professional learning opportunities when appropriate is another great idea. Finally, it's also important to gather input from your staff about how they would like to be acknowledged. One way schools have asked teachers to give feedback about what they want or what they need is through the lens of what should we do or provide to all teachers, what can we do for some, and what can we do for a few who need more intensified support. We've provided a few additional resources here around staff acknowledgement, including a copy of the Nebraska MTSS Care and Connection Google form. This can be sent out to all staff and then used at appropriate times throughout the year to identify small, tangible forms of recognition for individuals. Similarly, the Nebraska PBIS resource provides 35 free or inexpensive rewards for adults in the building. We've also included a template for a sample recognition slipper note, as well as articles from Final Sight, Better Leaders, Better Schools, St. Paul Public Schools in Minnesota, and Oracle that include an abundance of acknowledgement and recognition ideas.
So now we want to take a look at an effective approach to the problem-solving process and provide some examples of what data-based decision-making looks like in terms of your targeted improvement plan. As Peter Drucker says, you can't improve what you don't measure. Essentially, we need to collect and use data to improve the educational opportunities that we are providing to students and ultimately positively impact student learning outcomes. First, we want to revisit how Fidelity is the key to a school or district's infrastructure by ensuring effectiveness of an MTSS framework. Through the use of Fidelity assessments, key components of instructional strategies can be identified and described, which provides clarity and consistency. When teachers are aware of these instructional key components and how to implement them, they're more confident in their instruction, leading to higher efficacy. Teachers also need to utilize Fidelity data, which enables them to draw connections between the strategy they have implemented and the improved outcomes for students. This data-based decision-making plays an integral role in enhancing an MTSS framework. Beyond this, when we focus on Fidelity data, teams need to make sure that there are very clear responsibilities written so everyone knows what their roles are. By doing so, this allows for quality shared leadership to best support teachers and students. So while teams may vary their language and approach to the problem-solving process and how they analyze Fidelity measures and other data sources, the Nebraska MTSS framework guides teams around a 5-step process that can be utilized by your team. We will progress through the identify, analyze, plan, implement, and reflect steps of the model and provide you with guiding questions and tips for effective data analysis and planning in the following slides. As a reminder, data-based problem solving and decision-making should be occurring at all levels. For the sake of this webinar, we'll be showing you examples of how to use the Nebraska MTSS problem solving model at the district, school, and collaborative team levels in relation to strengthening implementation of your selected tip strategy. The first step of the problem solving model is identify. What is the problem that we are seeing in the data? While looking at various data sets, teams should start to ask themselves, what are the strengths that we see? And what are areas for growth? Teams should look at historical academic performance as well as current progress and growth, while drilling down specifically into different demographic groups. For example, what percent of students with disabilities are proficient in various areas in comparison to the overall district proficiency? There should also be a focus on process data. This should include looking at needs assessments and Fidelity data. If your district takes the Nebraska MTSS self-assessment, you would want to focus specifically on, say, question 13 on evidence-based instructional methods, or questions 21 and 22, which focus on Tier 1 core within a layered continuum of support. Other data points that teams may look at during this step might be graduation rates, chronic absenteeism, and student and adult perceptual data. During this identify step of the problem-solving model, your team will want to turn your reflections into what we call a precise problem statement. A precise problem statement is a way to describe the problem you are trying to solve in simple terms. It's typically focused on student learning and informed by multiple data sources. So let's work through a tip-related example together. So after analyzing their data, a team may determine that students with disabilities are more likely to receive a behavior referral than their peers. That is their precise problem statement. So we'll be returning to this same example throughout each step of the problem-solving process.
In step 2 of the problem-solving model, we'll start to analyze and ask, why do we believe this is occurring? Teams should go through a process of determining what symptoms are showing on the surface, what the problem might be, and finally determine the root cause. During this stage, teams will want to determine if there is any data missing and begin to identify patterns and trends. It's important that during this stage, teams are starting to make connections between what they are seeing in the different data sets. As we continue to dive deeper into the analyze step of the problem-solving process and reflecting on why we believe the results we are seeing are occurring, Anthony J. D'Angelo reminds us that when solving problems, we need to dig at the roots instead of just hacking at the leaves. Operational excellence consulting defines root cause analysis as a technique that helps guide people to discover and understand the initiating cause or causes of a problem, with the goal of determining missing or inadequately applied controls that will prevent recurrence. Root causes are things that can be controlled and allow for the generation of solutions. In this analogy from operational excellence consulting, there are symptoms that are obvious and can be seen on the surface as a problem. For example, if you weren't feeling well, your symptoms might be that you're feeling achy, weak, or tired. These symptoms are essentially the result or outcome of the problem. Or in the case of this analogy, your symptoms might be the result of a fever. Problems are gaps between your goal or standard of performance. In this case, a fever is a gap between your current state of health and typical wellness. Finally, the roots represent the system below the surface that are actually bringing about or causing the problem. In this analogy, the cause of the problem or fever, which is presenting itself in the symptoms of body aches and fatigue, is actually an infection. In this analogy, then, only taking Tylenol or ibuprofen for your body aches and fever would never cure the infection that is the root cause. To reiterate the quote from before, when solving problems, we need to dig at the roots instead of just hacking at the leaves. During this analyze step of the problem-solving process, your team will need to conduct a root cause analysis of your problem statement to identify your problem of practice. As you progress through this analysis, a root cause can be determined in a few different ways. For one, a root cause will be something that your team can influence and control. You will also know if you run into a dead end of answers as you continue to ask what caused the proposed root cause. To know you've reached the end of this process, you'll want everyone on the team to agree that this is a root cause, and it should be logical and provide clarity to the problem you identified in the first step. Finally, if the cause were to be dissolved, ask yourselves if there is realistic hope that the problem can be reduced or even prevented in the future. To return to our example from earlier, a team may have determined that based on data, students with disabilities were more likely to receive a behavior referral than their peers. This is their precise problem statement. On the surface, the symptom may be that 56% of students with disabilities had one or more office discipline referrals, also known as ODRs, at the end of the first quarter, in comparison to only 20% of their peers. The team would then ask themselves, why are they seeing these results? The response to why they are seeing that symptom is that 85% of those office discipline referrals for students with disabilities were for off-task behaviors. Why were so many students off task? The team determined that there is a lack of engagement in classrooms. Why? The team then noted that the average amount of opportunities to respond, or OTRs, was around 1.2 opportunities to respond per minute. However, research suggests that 3 to 5 OTRs per minute and 4 to 6 per minute for students with disabilities is best practice. When the team continued to ask why they believed they were seeing these results, they might also recall that only 30% of teachers reported feeling confident in planning and implementing regular OTRs on a recent informal self-assessment that was sent to staff. The team believed the reason why they are seeing this lack of confidence is because the district has not provided adequate and ongoing professional learning opportunities in the area of active student engagement. This is the root cause of the problem statement, because this is within the team's control and influence, and they are in agreement that it is the root cause.
So the third step of the problem-solving process is the planning stage. Here, teams should reflect on, all right, what can we do to solve this problem? They should address what they will be doing to address that root cause of the problem and what professional learning will be needed to provide to support the team in that plan. They should also be considering what trends in outcomes will help illuminate where instruction could have been stronger and how can they adjust instruction to support those learning needs. As we build on the example from earlier, where students with disabilities were likely to receive a behavioral referral, more likely to receive a behavioral referral than their peers, due to the district not providing adequate and ongoing professional learning opportunities in the area of active student engagement, we're going to start identifying a priority outcome, or what would we like to see as a result of our plan, and setting a priority goal for improvement. In this scenario, the team determined that the priority outcome they would like to see is an increase in on-task behavior for students with disabilities by specifically improving Tier 1 core active student engagement strategies for all. This can be achieved by increasing that number of opportunities to respond per minute in all classrooms. The specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound goal this team set was that by the end of the semester, educators will increase the number of opportunities to respond per minute from 1.2 to 3.6, as evidenced by a Fidelity walkthrough measure. This will also result in a decrease in office discipline referrals for off-task behavior for students with disabilities.
The next step of the problem-solving model is implement. Teams will start to identify the who, what, when, where, and how of their plans for improvement during this step. They'll determine high leverage next steps, the criteria for successful implementation, who will be involved, how they will support staff, professional learning that might need to occur, data sources that will be used to determine growth, when and where these action steps will occur, and ultimately, how will they approach this plan for improvement. In our example, the first thing the team will want to do is administer a brief active student engagement self-assessment to determine teacher confidence in implementing opportunities to respond. They'll want to do this right away and at the end of the semester to compare the data. Next, the administrators will prepare guidance for all of the PLCs to watch the explicit instruction crash course from this webinar series, specifically from the 22-minute mark to around 28 minutes, and respond to the discussion questions that are embedded within the clip around opportunities to respond. After the leadership team has analyzed the active student engagement self-assessment data, the teachers who indicated they have the least amount of confidence in implementing opportunities to respond will watch the active student engagement webinar from this series and respond to the discussions within their small group at the next teacher in-service day. The leadership team will also be pushing out weekly email blasts that contain specific strategies and ideas for teachers to use to increase opportunities to respond within their own classrooms. The team determined that there will be an expectation that teachers are embedding at least 2 out of the 3 variations of opportunities to respond, including verbal, written, or action responses in each of their lesson plans. Within this expectation, administrators will also be reviewing lesson plans and looking for these. Finally, administrators and instructional coaches will continue to conduct weekly opportunities to respond Fidelity walkthroughs and sharing that data with the staff as appropriate.
The final step of the problem-solving model is reflect, and this is potentially one of the most overlooked steps. During this stage, teams should reflect on what did and did not work. Did we do what we said we were going to do? And what is and what is not working? And what's the data that lets us know that? What should we continue to do as is, and what should be adjusted? And then is there anything that should be eliminated? And overall, are we just missing something in terms of our implementation? So to wrap up this first example, the district would need to review lesson plans, Fidelity data around opportunities to respond, teacher self-assessment data on confidence of implementing opportunities to respond, and then that outcome data of behavioral referral data, specifically office discipline referrals for students with disabilities, to reflect and determine if their plan had the impact it was intended to have.
We want to provide a few additional examples for the other tip strategies at different levels to ensure you and your team feel confident in utilizing data to guide your decision-making and implementation of your targeted improvement plan. Our first example will be a math department team looking to strengthen explicit instruction. So in this scenario, a 7-12 math department team or math collaborative team identified that high school students with disabilities are more likely to receive a D or F in math courses than their peers. The symptom on the surface was that 58% of students with disabilities in the secondary building were receiving a D or F in math. When they began the root cause analysis process, the team determined that students with disabilities were struggling to learn new math concepts through the current instructional practices that were being used. They thought this might be because there were not enough guided opportunities to practice in the math courses. The team continued to ask why and recognized that the majority of them do more of an immediate release of responsibility rather than a gradual release of responsibility when it comes to instruction. The root cause was determined to be that there has not been adequate professional learning and coaching around implementing gradual release of responsibility and providing ample opportunities to practice new skills. The priority outcome for the 7-12 math department team then what they would like to see is a decrease in the percentage of students with disabilities failing high school math courses and an increase in the use of explicit instruction at the Tier 1 core level for all students, specifically around gradual release of responsibility. The 7-12 math team set a priority SMART goal that by the end of the year, at least 90% of students with disabilities in the high school will pass their math courses, as evidenced by classroom grades. This will be achieved through improved Tier 1 core instructional practices in the area of explicit instruction and gradual release of responsibility. These efforts will also result in improved proficiency toward grade level math benchmarks. The math team planned for implementation by identifying a few key activities that would help them achieve their priority outcome and goal. First, they wanted to spend their next math collaborative team meeting or department meeting watching the explicit instruction crash course from this webinar series and engage in the discussions embedded within it. Then during future 7-12 math meetings, they want to collaborate on opportunities to embed gradual release of responsibility within their lesson plans with the intent of embedding these opportunities. Finally, the administrators and instructional coaches will continue to conduct explicit instruction and gradual release of responsibility Fidelity walkthroughs, and the 7-12 math team will continue to analyze that data. In the final step of the problem-solving process, the team should review and reflect on lesson plans, Fidelity data, math grades, and other student performance data to determine what did and did not work.
All right, so now we're going to progress through another example this time for a collaborative team or PLC. And this example, we're going to focus on positive and constructive feedback, which is another one of our tip strategies. So during a recent third grade PLC, the team crafted a precise problem statement that, based on recent Fidelity data, the positive to corrective feedback ratio in third grade classrooms was lower than the district average. In fact, the third grade ratio in this case was 1.5 to 1, whereas the district average was 3.5 to 1. So the third grade PLC asked themselves, why are they seeing these results? And upon further analysis, they determined that their positive to constructive feedback ratio is significantly lower in the afternoon, which actually brought down their overall average. So through further discussions, they determined this might be because instructional periods are much longer in the afternoon, which might lend to less feedback at times. And then also they kind of came to the root cause that increased fatigue in the afternoon was causing them to not use positive feedback as much. So this third grade PLC determined that their priority outcome they'd like to see as a result of their plan was to increase that positive to corrective feedback in all third grade classrooms, specifically in the afternoon, which then would in turn increase the district average as well as student motivation and efforts, which leads to improved learning outcomes. So the goal that they set for themselves was to increase their ratio of positive to corrective feedback from 1.5 to 2.5 to 1 by the end of the semester, as evidenced by Fidelity walkthrough data. So the third grade PLC is going to start their implementation plan by first viewing the positive and constructive feedback webinar and engaging in discussions that are embedded within it at their next PLC. In future PLC meetings, the third grade team will also be utilizing the Nebraska MTSS SEBL Coffee Connect videos, specifically around the nurturing yourself to grow your students recording and the self-management recording to foster continued discussions about strategies to self-manage and regulate to combat afternoon fatigue. The third grade teachers and the administrators are also committing to using various acknowledgement strategies like the ones mentioned earlier in the webinar to help increase that specific and positive feedback and recognize improvements over time. Finally, the third grade teachers are also holding themselves accountable to embed at least one planned brain break each afternoon within their lesson plans to help address maybe that afternoon fatigue that they're seeing. So then also as a team, they're developing a group contingency plan to hold each other accountable and increasing that positive feedback in the afternoons. What they decided to do was they're proposing to use golf trackers to monitor and track their use of positive to corrective feedback. They found the cost for each golf tracker is $15 and submitted that for approval to their administrators. Finally, the administrators and the instructional coaches will continue to conduct positive to corrective Fidelity walkthroughs on specific positive feedback. So to reflect on their efforts and to measure the impact of their plan, the third grade PLC will need to review their positive to corrective feedback Fidelity data, as well as student grades and other measures of academic performance.
In our final example, we'll be looking at a plan created by an elementary leadership team around strengthening flexible grouping practices. While analyzing data, the elementary team determined that there was a problem when they noticed that elementary students with disabilities are underperforming in reading compared to their peers. The symptom on the surface of this problem was that on the fall and winter reading screener, only 22% of students with disabilities in the elementary were meeting benchmark, while 75% of students without disabilities were meeting that benchmark. When they began to analyze why, they realized that not all students have access to grade level instruction, curriculum, and materials in the elementary. In fact, 60% of students with disabilities are not in groups with their peers during 100% of reading instruction in the elementary. The team continued to ask why and found that elementary reading groups are only based on perceived ability level. The team agreed upon the root cause of this being that 70% of elementary teachers responded to the Nebraska MTSS core belief survey that they do not believe that students with specific learning disabilities can achieve grade level benchmarks in reading. To plan to address the root cause of this problem, the elementary team wants to increase performance on the reading screener in the elementary, specifically for students with disabilities, by increasing teacher estimates of achievement and strengthening flexible grouping practices at the Tier 1 core level. They do plan to do this by having teachers incorporate more flexible grouping based on interest, learner profile, and reflection style teacher selected groups, rather than just based on perceived ability level. The elementary team set a priority SMART goal that by the end of the year, 50% of students with disabilities in K-6 will reach grade level reading benchmarks, as evidenced by the approved reading screener through the use of flexible grouping. This will also result in an increase of educators who believe students with specific learning disabilities can achieve grade level benchmarks in reading on the Nebraska MTSS Core Belief Survey. So there are a number of ways that this team determined to implement their plan to achieve those priority outcomes. To start, all K-6 teachers will watch the flexible grouping crash course that is part of this webinar series and participate in the discussions that are embedded within it at their next teacher in service. The K-6 school leadership team plans to watch the classroom implementation webinar on flexible grouping to determine an appropriate fidelity measure for their team. Once determined, the administrators and instructional coaches will conduct weekly flexible grouping fidelity walkthroughs. The team would also like to provide weekly email blasts with various flexible grouping strategies and ideas for teachers to try and use to strengthen their Tier 1 core practices. The expectation is also that teachers will include at minimum one opportunity for students to work in groups that are not based on readiness level per week. Beyond that, teachers are expected to use the learner profile cards at least once per month to determine student groupings. The K-6 school leadership team also plans to facilitate a professional development session to increase staff estimates of student achievement. They plan to start with an assumptions wall activity to identify assumptions that may be held throughout the district around learning for students with disabilities. After that, using John Hattie's research, the team plans to facilitate conversations around collective efficacy and the importance of holding a shared belief that they can support all students in achieving grade level benchmarks and that what they are currently doing has a positive impact on student learning. They will also provide guidance on the importance of relationships, providing feedback and scaffolding when it comes to holding high expectations for all students and facilitating successful flexible grouping. Finally, at the end of April, the K-6 school leadership team will administer the Nebraska MTSS Core Belief Survey and analyze the results to see if there's an increase in the percentage of teachers who believe students with specific learning disabilities can achieve grade level benchmarks in reading. To measure the impact of their plan, the team will review and reflect on lesson plans, flexible grouping fidelity data, Nebraska MTSS Core Belief Survey results, and reading screener data. As a reminder, database decision-making should be used at all stages of implementation, not just the full implementation stage. This is an ongoing process of reviewing and acting upon data. We also wanted to take a moment to remind you of the Continuous Improvement Plan, or SIP template, that was created in partnership with Nebraska MTSS and the Nebraska Department of Education. This is a great tool to ensure that your Targeted Improvement Plan, or TIP, efforts are integrated into your overall district-wide continuous improvement efforts. The new SIP template captures all areas of continuous improvement to reduce redundancy and ensure coherence across the state. It's structured to meet all regulatory requirements of Section 9 around continuous improvement and includes space for data analysis, action planning, which follows the steps of the Nebraska MTSS Problem Solving Model, a professional development log, along with components needed for the Targeted Improvement Plan and opportunities to make connections to other plans for reporting. If you're interested in accessing the SIP template, use the link on the slide to make a copy for your district, and don't hesitate to reach out to your regional lead with any additional questions you may have about getting started.
So to review, throughout this webinar, we recognize the role of database decision-making in relation to implementation science. We acknowledge the steps of the Nebraska MTSS Problem Solving Model as an approach to database decision-making, and we identified examples of utilizing that problem-solving model to support database decision-making within implementation of a school or district selected Targeted Improvement Plan, or TIP, evidence-based strategy. As we conclude, we want to thank you for taking the time to learn more about database decision-making. As a reminder, this is just one webinar as part of a series. If you would like to learn more about the 4 evidence-based strategies identified in the Targeted Improvement Plan, you can view a crash course webinar for each of those. If you'd like to learn more about implementing any of the 4 evidence-based strategies, we have a webinar titled Staff Rollout to assist in those efforts. Once you've had the opportunity to strategically roll out the evidence-based strategies, there are webinars titled Classroom Implementation that will assist in guiding implementation for each of those. As always, please visit the Nebraska MTSS website at nemtss.unl.edu to view all of the webinars, as well as find information needed to contact your regional support lead to address any questions you might have. Brooke and I thank you, and we hope you have a wonderful day.